going to go ahead and start with part 2 of the climate change topic, picking up pretty much where part 1 left off. Part 1 talking about the meaning of individual words in the topic and the big ideas of what each side needs to push or needs to not allow or get through to win the round. Going to talk a little bit more about specific ways that con can force the clash they want, and a couple of specific scenarios that can be pro-impacts or con defense. So one of the ways that con can make things difficult on pro is by agreeing with them on the science. That sounds counterintuitive at first, but you're probably going to win a science debate necessarily. The time suck can hurt you more than it hurts them. And this can leave pro teams who are expecting to win that global warming is real to win the round without a leg to stand on when they find out that you're not disagreeing with that. So one thing you could say on con, for instance, is warming is real, it's happening now, it's primarily caused by greenhouse gases such as CO2. Minor changes can't overcome positive feedback loops that exist in nature. Therefore, in order to actually mitigate its effect, developed nations must drastically lower their businesses and vehicles' carbon emissions. So if you don't do that, you're not actually mitigating the effects of climate change, and here's why you don't have a moral obligation, something which has that drastic a change, and will have these negative effects on your own country. You're not arguing that climate change isn't bad, you're not arguing that mitigating it wouldn't be good in a vacuum, you're arguing that other moral obligations to your own citizens and to your own country supersede the obligation that would otherwise exist. Pro, meanwhile, can argue, well, the obligation is still there, as long as it's something we should do. It doesn't matter if we have other competing moral obligations, we still have that moral obligation. And con will say, but you don't actually have that obligation. It's an obligation you could have, an obligation countries like yours could have. So basically, con is saying there, if you're not willing to undertake X, you don't actually think you have a moral obligation. You're not just taking a stance on whether the obligation exists or not, you're just saying that climate change exists, and that if someone believed there was a moral imperative, it would logically follow they'd have to implement this advocacy to fulfill that moral imperative. And here are 3 ways that advocacy is bad. And that's the second way that con can pin pro down, the first being when I talk at the end of the last one, where in order to mitigate the effects, they need to mitigate the causes. To mitigate the causes, they need to either agree with your definition or propose a specific way they would do that as an example. Again, you don't need to go into plan and counterplan territory, but it would be useful to know what are some ways countries have talked about doing this in the past. Capping carbon emissions, signing the Kyoto Protocol, switching to alternative energy. Lots of different things that could be done to mitigate the effects. Even more if mitigation includes adaptation, even more if effects include indirect effects as well as direct effects. So let's look at a couple impact scenarios in a little bit more detail. The first is just the idea of resource conflict. And I'll use India, Pakistan, and Kashmir as an example because it's an easy one with a lot of evidence about it. Right now, there's a very limited amount of water in many parts of India. Pretty much every arable piece of land is being farmed, more than 80%. This creates a situation where the water in Kashmir is very important, and the scarcity of resources that exist in Kashmir are what makes it just as important as the national pride. Glaciers melting in the mountains around Kashmir from climate change could trigger some large issues involving flooding, involving shortage of water in other places, involving polluted rivers being spread into non-polluted areas, so on and so forth. It could cause loss of resources for Pakistan, that could cause conflict. There's plenty of other places in the world as well where resources, not necessarily water, but just usable land, etc., could be important, where certain temperature ranges can be very important to countries' economies, countries' traditions, etc. So you can look at those and see, do those create areas which become important to contest? Do they create scarcity that makes keeping certain areas more important? Do they encourage expansionism? Do they create refugees? Do they destabilize regimes? Do they cause conflict in those ways? So that's the kind of practical IR impacts that you can look at as far as effects of climate change. Another one, aside from just the warming itself, would be other ways CO2 is harmful, and these can actually be more strategic for the protein than talking about warming itself directly. Even if Con wins, the Earth is cooling rather than warming, and even if they win that higher temperatures have some good effects, and even if they win that sea level rise isn't that bad and isn't happening that rapidly or isn't fully measurable, then Pro can still win, that these are other reasons that more CO2 is bad, and the easiest reason to explain in this subcategory is the concept of ocean acidification. More CO2 in the oceans makes them more acidic. Once they've reached a certain capacity to hold CO2, not only will they have difficulty absorbing more and will they not be as much of a carbon sink, but the CO2 already in there will alter the pH of the oceans in such a way that it might kill phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are important because they produce 50% of the world's oxygen, and them going extinct would be bad news for every species that happens to breathe oxygen. This allows you to bypass a lot of debates about warming itself and simply say CO2 is bad, whether or not it causes warming, because it can cause mass extinctions of species that rely on oxygen in the ocean and possibly outside of the ocean as well. Two other kinds of scenarios are more philosophical. The first one just comes from kind of a cause and effect way, the second one from more of a social justice way. The first is that this moral obligation comes in the form of an unpaid debt for development. Developed countries developed through their own industrial revolutions, through polluting, through changing the climates. Developing countries have to deal with the climate that developed countries created. It is not called local warming for a reason. The climate that the US created when it industrialized is a climate that its neighbors have to deal with. This, over time, spreads across continents and even beyond, affecting the entire ecosphere, and this causes situations where you can say the people who created the mess by developing and are developed now have an obligation to those who would like to develop to mitigate the effects that they created for them. They broke it, they fix it is a pretty simple syllogism that can play well with a lot of different judges. You don't have an obligation to completely negate the effects, but you do need to somewhat mitigate them. You do need to slow them down. You don't need to mitigate all effects, but you do need to make up for the mess you caused. This is basic ethics as taught in day one of kindergarten, and is something that is fairly difficult to argue against directly, and forces Kant to argue around in some of the ways we talked about earlier. The last kind of scenario is the idea of a social justice scenario, that the effects of warming hurt developing countries much worse than developed countries. Most developed countries are in zones of the globe where warming hurts them less, so they can cause more of it and experience less of it, and they have a moral obligation to help the countries that exist in areas that are more devastated by natural disasters caused by climate change, that are more sensitive to fluctuations in temperatures, whose economies, agricultures, livelihoods rely much more on a specific set of climate. That some of the areas that suffer from the worst famine have done so because of changes to climate caused by the industrialization of developing countries. That even in developed countries, the wealthy and privileged live in areas of those countries that have incredible environmental impacts. When you compare suburban life to urban life in the United States, for instance, urban life in and of itself has a much smaller environmental impact, but the desire of people to flee from the city, to live in the suburbs in communities of their choosing, to drive everywhere, to have their gas-guzzling SUVs, to have long amounts of roads that are only used for residential reasons, to have big yards to keep them far away from undesirable neighbors, so on and so forth. All of those might be examples of what's called environmental justice, of creating a situation where you have a social imperative as a developed country to mitigate the gap both between your privileged and less privileged citizens and between your country as a whole and other countries which are in areas of the world that are much more vulnerable to the changes you have created and that you don't have to deal with yourself directly. So those are a few scenarios. We've talked about a couple ways that con can focus the debate down. We've talked about a couple fairly intuitive arguments pro can make. If you have any other questions about what to do with this topic, by all means, leave a comment underneath this video and I'll see if I can get back to you. If I get enough good questions, I'll make a third video that tries and answer all those responses together. Hopefully this video was a little clearer and a little more comprehensive since I'm switching to a new camera for this one. Let me know if that works out for you guys as well. Best of luck on this topic. Hope to see those of you debating it at tournaments.